Hi, my name's Yasser Seirawan. We're currently in our offices in Philadelphia, here on 7th and Snyder. At the back, we have my files and desk. And on the table in front of me, we have the various manuscripts that contain the entire Video Chess Mentor series. The VCM was quite a chore in putting together, let me tell you. It's over 2.5 years in the making. What I discovered in all my research was something very unusual. There wasn't any universal teaching system method. Well, the question became how to present the information. Let me show you what we did. We shot many scenes, including this one at the U.S. Blitz Championship in Somerset, New Jersey, as well as the prestigious World Open here in Philadelphia. I gave 2 simultaneous exhibitions, playing 40 people at one time, one at the University of Pennsylvania and one at the Port History Museum. At these exhibitions, the mayor and city of Philadelphia presented me with proclamations. I also interviewed 6-time U.S. champion Walter Brown and former U.S. champion and syndicated columnist Larry Evans. Many people have asked me for whom the series is aimed, for beginner, chess master, chess grandmaster. And to their question, I respond, to all of you. We have POIs, or points of information, for all levels of players, ranging from beginners to international grandmasters. This series is meant to be a challenging one, to challenge you to rise. The way to view this tape is to view it all the way on your first viewing. Don't stop the tape. Listen to me. Pay attention. Don't dwell on any thought or question you might have. Play the tape through. Watch the tape. Have faith in me as an international grandmaster, and don't worry, all your questions will be answered. This tape is broken into 2 study segments. The first study segment will teach you the board and its properties, the pieces and their values, and the 4 elements. Also, a classical opening. Before we go to the studios, let me take you to the demos and learn a bit about the board and its properties. We have broken down the board into 8 ranks, 8 files. This is the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H files. 8 ranks, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. Therefore, each square has a corresponding letter and number, A1, B1, C1, and so on. These are the long diagonals, and the 2 critical files are the E and D files, the center files. The center is this key area right here. This is the sweet center, these 4 squares. Over here, we have the queen side. White's queen side, black's queen side. And over here, we have the king side. White's king side, black's king side. Let's go back and learn how to set up the chessboard. Keep in mind that we have white space and black space. We now have the starting position. White has his space, these 32 squares here, and black has his space, these 32 squares there. 2 things that I'd like to point out. In print, as well as in video, white is on the bottom, black on the top. And you always set up the board with the right hand, lower right-hand corner square, white. We'll now go to the studio and learn about the 3 types of positions, the pieces, and their values. Now for the three types of positions. When all 16 pawns are on the board, we say the position is closed. You take 1 pair of pawns off the board, and the position becomes half open. If you take 2 pawns or more from the board, then the position is open. So we start the position closed, and usually most games end up being open. Our first piece will be the queens. The queens, being the most powerful pieces, are worth 9. They work best in an open position and in the openings are best left at home until the position becomes open. Our second major pieces are the rooks. Rooks are worth 5. They're very clumsy in the opening and the early middle game, and they work also best in open positions, and especially in the endings when they really come, and it's in the endings when they become the most powerful. Also, they're very good defenders. Our first type of minor pieces are the bishops. The bishops also work best in open positions, and in the openings, they're like the rooks. They're very, very clumsy. Oftentimes, an open diagonal suddenly becomes closed, and you have no idea what went wrong, but suddenly the bishops no longer are as good as you thought they were. Beginners have a great deal of trouble with both the bishops and the rooks. It's best to keep in mind that they operate best in open positions. Our next minor pieces are the knights. The knights, like the bishops, are also worth 3. Unlike most of the other pieces, however, the knights work best in half-open and closed positions. The kings, the most important piece, we give a value of 3.5 to. That is to say, masters give a value of 3.5 to the kings. The kings are the most important piece. If you lose the king, or if you get checkmated, the game is over. But for purposes of force count and attacks, it's important to assign the king a value, and masters give it 3.5. The value system, or how the value system came about, is an interesting story in itself. The pawns are the least mobile and least valuable piece, or chess man, and we assign it a value of 1. The queen being the most mobile piece, that is to say, she can go all over the board very quickly within 1 or 2 moves, we give her, or assign her, a value of 9. The rooks also being a piece that can go to all 64 squares, but not as quickly as the queen, we give a value of 5. The bishops can go quickly to the squares about the chessboard, but they are limited to 32 squares as opposed to 64. That's why they only have a value of 3. The knight, although it can go to all 64 squares, can't get there as quickly as, say, a bishop or other long-range piece, and we give it a value of 3 only because it can go to all 64 squares. The king can also go to all 64 squares, but it also goes slowly. But for the purposes of the value system that I have, we give it 3.5. The value system leads us to the 4 elements, which in my interview with Larry, he briefly enumerated. Larry?
There are 4 elements in chess, as you know, Yasser: time, space, force, and pawn structure. And of the 4, force in itself is the most important. All other things being equal, if you're a pawn ahead, you're going to win the game. And Bobby Fischer feels the same way. I mean, if he'll snatch any pawn as long as he feels that he's not going to be demolished by it. He's willing to suffer for a long time.
Thanks, Larry. Each element influences our decisions in different ways. Chess is a very materialistic game. The most important element is force, or material. And when I'm talking about force, I'm talking about the overall force count. Learn to pair off pieces. For example, in this particular position, 3 versus 3, 3, 3, White's a knight ahead. He's +3 in the force count. He's ahead +3 in the value system. On this demo board, 4, 3, 2, 2, rooks pair off, bishops pair off, knights pair off. You determine that White is ahead 1 in the force count. Whenever you're ahead in the force count, you're winning. Force determines who's winning, all the way from levels of grandmasters to amateurs. Force also teaches something else, and that's how to attack. For example, over here, divide the board in half, and on the king's side, White has a preponderance in force, so he should look to attack there. On the queen's side, Black has a preponderance of force, so he should look to attack there. From calculating the force on each side of the board, you're going to get a very accurate reading as to whether or not an attack is going to work or fail. Our second and third elements, space and time, we'll be discussing in the studio. Our fourth element, pawn structure, we'll look at in study segment 2 and 3. Now let's go to the studio to study space and time. What I mean by space is that here, White controls 32 squares, or this is White's half of the board, this is Black's half of the board. When White plays a move like e4, he controls 5 of black's spaces. d5 and f5, h5 with the queen, and the bishop on f1 controls a6 and b5. So white has +5 at the moment in the space count. The person who controls more space than the opponent will have the more valuable pieces. The person who has the more valuable pieces will become the attacker, or the person who has space will become the attacker. So space determines the roles of each player. Space determines who's the attacker, who's the defender. Time, our third element, is determined by how many pawns and pieces are moved from their original squares. The person who develops more quickly, or who mobilizes his forces more quickly, will control more space. Thus, the person who develops more quickly will in turn become the attacker. There are 7 basic principles in chess. These are classical principles that generations of chess masters have handed down. They're very important for you to be aware of, so learn to use them and utilize them in your games as you're making your decisions. The basic principles are: always play for control of the center, and of course with specific emphasis on the sweet center. Open with an e-pawn or d-pawn. Don't develop your queen too early. If you do, she'll become the object of attacks. But most beginners love to develop the queen early, and it's a big mistake, and it's a fundamental error. Leave your queen at home. That's where she belongs, in the opening. Next principle: develop your knights before your bishops. The bishops have a difficult time in the opening because they're rather clumsy, whereas the knights, the moment they're developed, they become very effective immediately. Don't move the same piece twice. Once you developed your knights, develop other pieces in your camp. Having developed your knights, develop your bishops, here, and prepare to shelter your king by castling. The purpose of castling: you develop 2 pieces at one time in the time count, and you quickly bring your king to a nice safe haven and shelter your king. Finally, don't attack without justification. You have to ask yourself before you attack, what is the advantage that I have in the position that justifies an attack? And you have to have an advantage in one of the 4 elements. We'll now go to a classical opening, exemplifying all we've learned to this point. It's getting a little hot here underneath his lights, and it's about time to get serious. Dave, would you please take my jacket? Dave's my assistant here on the boards. First, we'll now go through a classical opening from White's perspective. White opens e4, e5, regaining what we call in chess the equilibrium. That's to say, White has the advantage because he can tip the scales in his favor to begin, and Black responds by creating an equal position. Knight f3, attacking e5, knight c6 defending e5. White plays bishop c4, developing his bishop on the classical diagonal. It would have been a mistake for White to play the move d3. This would lock in the bishop on f1, making it a less of an effective piece. So White first plays bishop c4. This move signals what we call the Italian opening. Black responds, bishop c5, in developing his bishop. In the same manner, a mistake for Black would be the move d6, which would also lock in his bishop. Black develops his bishop on the classical diagonal, c5. White plays c3. The role in the opening of the c-pawn is basically to attack or support an advance in the center. Most of the time, you'll be playing strictly with the e and d pawns in the opening. After c3, plays knight f6, attacking e4. In this situation, the position is still closed. White now has a choice. He can play d3, in which case we get into what we call the Italian closed, or we can play our main line, which is d4. This is the Italian open. After d4, the position now becomes half open. Black exchanges pawn for pawn. When playing the move d4, white establishes what we call the center pawn duo. It's an extremely powerful structure. On the life set, what we have is pawns for white on e4 and d4. They occupy the sweet center as well as control black's squares e5 and d5. The center pawn duo is a very, very powerful structure. It basically occupies and controls the entire sweet center. In a game that I had with Michael Rode in the U.S. Blitz Championship in New Jersey this year, I had an opportunity to establish the pawn center. I played the move e4. This controls the entire white center as well as black from f5 to the square b5. In addition, it restrains my opponent's idea, which was for him to play the move f5. After I established the center pawn duo, Michael went into a 50-second thinking spell. This gave the cameraman a chance to catch a few railbirds rubbernecking the action. The chess clock that you see here is used to time the player's moves. In blitz chess, each player has just 5 minutes for the entire game, so 50 seconds is a lot of time. The center pawn duo has made it difficult for Mike to find an active plan. At last, he moves. Once I've castled, the opening is almost over. We'll come back to this game later. Enough of that. Let's get back to the main line. After d4, black is presented with a very typical problem in the opening. What to do with the bishop? He's now attacked and he's forced to move it again, which violates one of the basic principles. Hey, but when you're forced to move, you're forced to move. Black plays bishop b4, check to the white king. White has two possible responses. The best move is bishop d2, which will be our main line. But another response that's possible for white is the move knight c3. The problem with knight c3 is it places the knight into an absolute pin. The pin is the first of our 14 types of tactics. All 14 tactics will be covered in study segments 1 through 4. There are 3 types of pins. The first is an absolute pin. The bishop pins the knight to the king absolutely. The knight can't move because that would be illegal, as the king would be in capture. This is known as an absolute pin. You can never leave your king in capture. Our second type of pin is called a relative pin. Here, the bishop pins the knight to the queen. The knight can move, but only at the loss of the queen. It's a relative pin. Our third type of pin is called the cross pin. There'll be one down the road. Look for it. A cross pin is when a piece is pinned in 2 separate directions. Here, the bishop on b4 pins the knight to the king, as well as the rook pins the knight to the queen. Now then, let's go back to the studios for the classical opening. After the move bishop d2, black is given an option: trading bishops or capturing the pawn. Bishop captures d2 check will be our main line. But what if he captures the pawn? Well, we'll take that right over here. After knight captures e4, this allows white an opportunity to regain his sacrifice pawn with an advantage. He'll employ what we call a double attack. Bishop takes b4. Knight takes b4. This gives you a unique opportunity to play. Bishop takes f7 check. King takes f7. And now the double attack. Queen b3, checking the king on f7, as well as the knight on as well as attacking the knight on b4. White regains his piece with advantage because black's king is now opened. Back again to the main line. After bishop captures d2 check, white will guard his e-pawn with a move knight on b captures d2, defending our center pawn duo, I should say. After knight takes d2, black now employs a double attack of his own. He plays d5, attacking c4, a bishop on c4, and our pawn on e4. Now remember what I told you. Basic principle, don't move pieces unnecessarily. In this situation, instead of moving his bishop, the best thing that we should do is play e captures d5. After ed, knight captures d5, we have a full stop for a moment. I told you, don't bring out your queen early and don't attack without justification. But in this particular moment, white does have justification to begin an attack. And what he does is he sets up a battery, another type of tactic. Queen b3. The purpose of this idea of attack is to pin the knight on d5. Why is white justified in creating this attack? He's justified because he's ahead in the time count, one of our 4 elements. That is to say, before you play the move queen b3, count the pieces. How many pieces has white developed? How many pieces have black developed? If you have a +2 or more in the time count, you're justified in beginning an attack. And what do I mean by attack? Well, I shouldn't say, but in a future study segment, I'll get more to it. But an attack doesn't have to be a bridge-burning assault against the enemy king. It can be fight for a center file, a center square, or just for development. Queen b3, creating a battery on the a2, g8 diagonal, attacking the knight on d5. Knight on d5 can't move because of the pin. Black reinforces his knight with the move knight on c to e7. White now castles, but full stop again. Critical decision. One of the most important decisions you can make in the opening is where to place your king, because it has long-term ramifications. White can castle queenside or kingside. White chooses kingside castling, one of our basic principles, castling early. The reason that he castles to the king side as opposed to the queen side is because the pawn shelter is better on the king side. But that's study segment 2. After castles, the opening is soon over. Now it's time to evaluate the position. We'll evaluate the position from the elements, from the point of view of the elements. The force count is even. In the time count, white is ahead 7-4, or a +3. What do I mean? White has developed king on g1, rook, knight, pawn, knight, bishop, queen for 7. Black has developed 4. King, rook, and both knights, 4. 7-4, white has a +3 in the time count. In addition, white controls more space, which gives him an advantage in time and space. So why is black in a bad position? What has black done wrong? Well, in actuality, black has done nothing wrong. Black has his own compensations, and those compensations are in the form of the pawn structure. But that's skipping ahead. You'll have to go to study segment 2 to understand what I mean by the pawn structure. Another very interesting opening middle game that I'd like to evaluate is a game that I had with Alexander Chernin, the champion of the Soviet Union, also in the Blitz tournament in New Jersey. In this position, what I was playing the black pieces, Chernin was playing the white pieces, is we have a half-open position to start out with. In addition, black has an extra center pawn as compared to white's e4 pawn, and black is already on what we call the half-open file. White isn't on his half-open file. This is a typical Sicilian-type structure, and black has a distinct marked advantage. After Chernin exchanged a pair of knights, I was able to create a battery on the half-open C file. While the cameraman watched some of the other top games, I began to push my pawns forward. Chernin brought a rook from the king side to help defend his queen side, to which I was applying strong pressure. I continued to gain space by advancing my pawns. This game was a tense one for two reasons. As an American, I view any encounter with a Soviet player as a key matchup, and since Chernin and I were the favorites in this Blitz tournament, this game could easily have decided first place. After d5, the position is about to be forced open, and it's still anybody's game, as we'll discover. That concludes Study Segment 1. I'd now like to share with you some of our efforts to promote Blitz. Here in the U.S., professional world of chess is played in two main fashions, tournament and 5-minute. Let me show you the contrast. You've seen a little Blitz chess. This is the more grueling form of tournament chess. Here at the World Open, over $200,000 in prizes was awarded to players of different classes, ranging from novices to grandmasters like myself. More than 1,500 players competed for these prizes. Tournament chess is much more sedate than Blitz. People think over their moves for minutes and sometimes even tens of minutes, whereas in Blitz chess, your moves have to come within seconds. Otherwise, you're going to be in danger of losing on time. In the World Open, the average length of the games is between 4 and 5 hours. Blitz is a whole different story. In Blitz chess, each player has only 5 minutes for the entire game. Thus, a game cannot last longer than 10 minutes. This fast pace gives players who think quickly and move quickly a big edge. Blitz chess appeals to all levels and ages of players. Another interesting aspect of the chess clock is that the stronger player can be handicapped to make the game more competitive. During a break at our studio shoot, the producer's children, Jesse and Tina, played a Blitz game, watched by their youngest sister, Kara.
And Daddy kiss together.
Tina, the weaker player, had 5 minutes to Jesse's 1 minute.
And this time, castle. The game's over, my flag dropped.
Hey, Tina won!
Hey, you! I like the flag drop, and Daddy goes, hey, you!
You lost on time? Oh, look at this. Congratulations. As you see, Tina used her advantage on the clock to score a rare victory over her older brother. Because of its quick resolution, Blitz is one of the most popular forms of competitive chess. We're now ready to begin Study Segment 2. Keep in mind that you have a pause and rewind button. Use it after your first viewing. Watch the tape all the way through on the first time. Have faith in me as an international grandmaster to answer your questions. Sooner or later, I'll get through them all. So far, I've given you the basics. Now I'd like to give you what I consider the white meat of the tape, which is how to make a plan using the pawn structure. Let's go to the studio. Early in my career, my biggest difficulty was finding a plan for a particular position. Indeed, the ability to find a plan separates all levels of players. How to find a plan? What to base your plan upon? Should you base it upon where the king is, where a knight is, where a rook is? What to do? Many factors are temporary. What we need to do is find a factor that will be good or valid for all or most of all positions. And that factor is pawn structure. Pawn structures determine the nature of the position. They tell us what are the open files, open diagonals, whether the king is sheltered and protected. They give us many, many clues. For example, here is what we have. It's called a pawn skeleton. In this pawn skeleton, white is attacking on the queen side. That is to say, he should look to attack on the queen side. He shouldn't look to attack on the king side. The open file is the E file, where you would place your rook. Knights would be very nicely placed on E5 or B4 or A5. Black squared bishop you would put on F4. Also, rook would go on B1. You wouldn't want your king on the queen side because that's where you're attacking. So you would want your king on the king side. Little things like this is how you'll determine your best plan for a given position. There are 3 categories of pawn structures: weak pawn structures, balanced pawn structures, and dynamic pawn structures. Our first look will be at weak pawn structures. They're important for two reasons. You must know what to avoid, and you must know what kind of pawn structures to give your opponent. Our first weak pawn structure is pawn islands. In this situation, white has 3 pawn islands. Pawns on b3 and a4 are 1, pawn on d4, 2. These kingside pawns are 3. Black has 2 pawn islands. This chain of pawn is 1 pawn island, pawn on a5 is another. Although the h4 pawn is not protected by pawn, say, on g3, it can be, and is not considered a pawn island of itself. Pawn islands are weak because they need protection of the pieces. If you tie up your pieces too much, then they can't do what you would like them to do. First example of weak pawn structures is a continuation of my game with Chernin, that I showed you earlier in study segment 1, and it's now here in the middle game. In this situation, count white's pawn islands. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. White has 5 pawn islands. Black has 2. Black began with the move rook a8. We'll see how it happened. I am now attacking 2 of white's pawns, the pawn on a5 and the pawn on e4. Knight f3 attacking my rook. Rook c5 reacting to the threat. e5, pushing his Isolani to attack my knight. Knight g4, once again attacking the Isolani. I'm down 1 in the force count, but I've compromised Chernin's pawn structure by giving him an Isolani, split queenside pawns, and a doubled A pawns, which you'll learn about. Now, Chernin looks into the tactics stemming from knight takes g5, and instead decides upon c4, dissolving his split pawns. After trading on c4, I grab the A pawn, creating a battery. Again, I have a doubled attack against white's pawns. Knight captures e5. At last, I'm ahead in the force count by 1. Even so, this is a blitz game, and he is the Soviet champion, so the game is far from over. Later in this tape, we'll see how it finished. Now let's take a closer look at the Isolani. Our next weak pawn structure is the isolated pawn. Like pawn islands, it doesn't refer to any specific structure, but rather a pawn, and an independent pawn, because that's what an isolated pawn is. In this situation, white has an isolated pawn on d3. If he was to capture a piece on c3 and play the move, say, b captures c3, the pawn on a2 would become isolated. These pawns would no longer be isolated. Pawn on d3 is isolated, or whenever a center pawn, a d or e pawn is isolated, we refer to it as an Isolani. The most typical types of Isolani position is when the Isolani is on d4. The Isolani is weak because it needs protection. It can't be protected by a pawn. But another serious weakness or defect of the Isolani is the square right in front of the Isolani. The reason for that is that if black were to establish a piece there, for example, a knight or a bishop, he would blockade the pawn, and white wouldn't be able to get rid of the blockader. Another typical Isolani type feature is when the pawn's on d5 and there's a fianchetto in the position. Just from this pawn skeleton, you can get a very good idea of where the player's plan should lie. White has 2 open files, the C and the E files. That's where his rooks belong. He also has more space in the center, so he should be anticipating playing towards the center. From black's point of view, black will have fianchettoed his bishop on g7. His open files are the C and D files. That's where he'll place his rooks. And the knights will probably be placed on f6 and b6 to attack the d pawn. In a game example I had with fellow Grandmaster, I had the white pieces, and Anatoly, he had the isolated pawn, or the Isolani. My rooks are in a battery. They're doubled on the D line, and his queen is in a pin. Anatoly played queen e8 to get out of the pin. White had been threatening to play e3 and capture the pawn. I now chose to play the move knight d5. This is a very typical type thing that a lot of players get confused about. It's very simple. For knights to be effective, they must be centralized. Again, I'm referring to the specific central area. I wasn't worried by the double attack knight b4. The reason for that is because when you're playing an Isolani type situation, what you need to do is trade minor pieces. Okay? The isolated pawn becomes weaker and weaker the more minor pieces you get off. You want to play a major piece endgame. Knight b4 would have played right into my hands. After knight b4, with the double attack against the queen, queen b3, an exchange of knights on d5, bishop captures d5, exchange of bishops on d5, and it's quite evident that this pawn, which is now attacked by 3 of white's pieces, will soon be lost. As a result, this endgame is certainly lost. So, again, in isolated pawn positions, you want to play major piece endgames. After knight d5, my opponent didn't play knight b4, he prepared. He played queen e6. The purpose of this move was to prepare the double attack knight b4. So I got out of this discovery, queen a4, and after queen a4, I bring more pressure on black's queen side, and in addition, again, attack the weak pawn. After queen a4, rook d8, attacking the knight, knight f4, attacking the queen, queen e5. It becomes obvious that black's major problem in the position is his weak pawn. If he could trade that pawn, he'd have no problems. And all white needs to do is really simply win that pawn, and the game is lost. Well, in order to win this pawn, I have to get rid of the defender. This is known as a tactic of removal of the guard. I play rook c2. This seals the fate of the pawn, because as soon as that defender is forced to move, doink, game's over. He's going to lose the pawn. After rook c2, I'm bearing down for a 3rd time on the attacked knight. Black was forced to trade queens with the move queen a5. After queen a5, queen captures a5, knight captures a5, rook takes c8. If my opponent recaptures with the rook, then I trade bishops and I win the pawn right away. So he recaptured with the bishop. And after bishop captures c8, I played knight d5. Once again, interfering with the defense of the d4 pawn. My opponent was in a jam. He couldn't defend the pawn with knight c6 because this would leave him vulnerable to a fork. After rook c1, if the knight moves, then I play knight e7 check, forking the king and bishop. And if he plays bishop defending the knight, then I play rook captures c6, bishop captures c6, knight e7 check. A double attack is any piece other than the knight, because the knight, when it forks, it can fork 2 pieces or 3 pieces or 4 pieces. A royal fork is when a knight forks a king and queen. A family fork is when a knight forks a king, queen, or rook. After knight e7 check, white wins in force and will win the game. So, in this position, after knight d5, my first interference move, then came bishop e6, rook captures d4. I've won the pawn, and the game is now lost for black. But there's a nice tactic that I'd like to share here, and it went like this. king f8 in order to get out of the knight check, discovering an attack on the rook. After king f8, f4, this move prepares to develop the king, because in the endgame, your king becomes more powerful and you should look to use him. In the middle game and so on, he's very vulnerable, but as the endgame approaches, look to use the king. Knight c6, attacking the rook, rook d3. My opponent decided that if he waited too long, I was just going to win, being ahead in force, so he forced the situation. He played knight e7, attacking my knight. I played knight c7, attacking his rook. He exchanged rooks. Now I've produced another type of tactic, and this is called a Zwischenzug. Keep in mind that chess is an international game with an international character. Zwischenzug is a German word whose English equivalent is an in-between move. White makes an in-between move. Instead of recapturing the rook at once, I captured the bishop with check, forcing fe. And then after recapturing the rook, I was ahead a pawn in an endgame of minor pieces. In a minor piece endgame, the bishop is generally considered superior to the knight when there are pawns on both sides, on both flanks. So in addition to the advantage of having the bishop over the knight, I also have an extra pawn, and I won rather easily. Our next weak pawn structure are double pawns. Double pawns are the result of captures. In this skeleton, black has double pawns on c6 and c7. Double pawns are less mobile, and they eventually become targets. They're especially vulnerable to knights. A key element when you have or when you possess the double pawns is to learn to push the most forward. This is a situation that I had with Michael Rode in New Jersey. I was playing white, and I played c5. Let's see what happened in the visuals. c5 dissolves my double pawns. After his capture, I now play bishop b5, placing Mike's knight in an absolute pinch. He castles long because his kingside pawns are attacking and would not adequately shelter his king. But queenside castling has its drawbacks. You'll understand why when we continue this game on tape 2, study segment 4. After queen captures a4, I've equalized the force count, dissolved my double pawns, and begun a queenside attack. Let's return to the studio and see another example of double pawns. In this situation, white has double pawns on c4 and c3. If that was his only problem, he wouldn't stand too badly off, but he also has done terrible things with his minor pieces. His bishop on a3 is on a bad diagonal. It's on a blocked diagonal. Bishops need open diagonals to be effective. In addition, his knight on h4 is decentralized. It's out of the game. Black began the move knight c6, attacking the pawn on d4. White defends with rook d1. After rook d1, black forked the queen on b3 and the pawn on c4. The only move white could make was queen b5. In this position, black made the decision to exchange queens and take advantage of his endgame possibilities. He did it as follows. Queen takes b5, cb, knight c4, attacking the bishop on a3. Bishop came back to c1. After bishop c1, black needed to open up the positions for his rooks. He did that by playing a6. After a6, b takes a6, rook takes a6. White had split queenside pawns, the a2 and the c4 pawn, c3 pawn. After rook takes a6, d takes c5, b takes c5. Not only does he have split pawns, but he has a 3-to-1 pawn islands advantage in favor of black. White hastened to bring his knight back, knight g2. After knight g2, Black played knight d5, attacking the isolated pawn on c3. White defended with rook d3. Black created a battery on the A line, doubled his rooks, and the pawn on a2 is lost. White is now completely lost, as a matter of fact. His pieces are totally tied up. His structure is in shambles. Black is about to win a pawn. White made a further error by the move e4. After e4, instead of moving his knight right away, Black made a Zwischenzug. He first attacked White's rook. White's rook found itself in a terrible predicament. If it moves to d2, then it's forked by the move knight f3 check, winning an exchange. So he was forced to move to d1. After rook d1 came knight capture c3, again forking the rook and the pawn. The rook can't move to e1 because of the move knight f3 check. It was forced to move to f1, and after rook f1, Black won the second pawn with rook takes a2, and White gave up as he saw that he was 2 pawns down and he's probably going to lose a third. Here you saw an example how difficult it was for White to have any play once he had double pawn, and how easy it was for Black to exploit those double pawns. There's another type of double pawns that are even weaker than normal double pawns, and that's isolated double pawns. I consider isolated double pawns so bad as to reduce their value by half. In this skeleton, White has 2 sets of isolated double pawns. The pawns on a2 and a3 are doubled and isolated. The pawns on c2 and c4 are doubled and isolated. And although we would say that in the force count, in the strict force count, White has 2, 4, 6 pawns. Black has 2, 4, 5 pawns. White is a point ahead in the force count. But because of the way I look at isolated double pawns, I reduce 2 for White. 1 here, each pawn is reduced by half, and 1 here, each pawn is reduced by half. So actually, I say that Black is ahead in the force count, 5 to 4. Our next weak pawn structure is the backward pawn. In this skeleton of the backward pawn formation, the pawn on d6 is backward because its advance is prevented by the pawn on e4. When you're playing against it, what you should try to do is restrain it, then blockade it, and finally destroy it. That was Nimzovich's theory for how to play against backward pawns. The backward pawn structure gives the player with the backward pawn a very cramped game, and particularly bad will be his bishop on e7 or the bishop that protects the backward pawn. With that bad bishop, what the player should try to do is exchange it if he has the bad bishop, or avoid exchanging it if you're playing against the backward pawn formation. The main line that we'll be looking at is this position. In this position, both players have fianchettoed their king's bishop. Black has the backward pawn, and what he'll be looking to do is to advance his pawn and try to exchange it off. The moment he's able to do that, he'll be fine. He'll have no problems in the position. What White has to do is restrain that pawn from advancing. White does this very nicely. He plays a very, very subtle move, rook c1. The pawn structure, the skeleton of the pawn structure, predicts that this would have been the better move, rook d1, bringing a rook to the open file, or what we call the half-open file. Instead, he plays rook c1 with the purpose to play c4, because when he plays the move c4, then the backward pawn cannot be advanced. Black now played f5. f5, White played c4, restraining the pawn. Black took on e4, and now White played the move knight c3, again, further restraining the pawn. Black saw that it was soon going to be impossible to play the move d5, so he gave up that idea and brought his knight to f5. If Black had tried to capture the c4 pawn with, say, the bishop, bishop takes c4, then he walks into a pin on the C line. And after bishop takes c4, would come knight takes e4, pinning the queen and the bishop. Followed by the move b3, white would advantageously win back the bishop on c4. On the other hand, if black plays the move queen takes c4, if black plays queen takes c4, then after knight takes e4, white would have a discovered attack against the queen on c4, as well as a double attack against the pawn on d6. White would regain his pawn with advantage. So, back to the main variation. After knight c3, knight f5, knight takes e4. Black now traded his knight for the bishop. Knight takes e3, queen takes e3. And he saw that he had to prevent the move knight g5, attacking the bishop on e6. So he did this by the move h6. After h6, what white's strategy is now is, again, keeping that pawn on d6 from moving. So he played b3, buttressing c4. After b3 came rook d8, rook d1, rook c8, rook c1, b6. Now, after restraining the pawn from playing to d5, white prepares to blockade it. Plays knight c3. The purpose of this move is that the bishop on g2 defends d5 as well as the knight on c3. After knight c3, queen e7, white played bishop d5. This allows me to explain one of the advantages of fianchettoing the bishop. Fianchettoing the bishop is a hyper-modern strategy which was basically seen at the turn of this century. The idea behind a fianchettoed bishop is it remains on the long diagonal, pressures the sweet center. The fianchettoed bishop also defends the king. In addition, it can sometimes play itself back to f1 on a more open diagonal, the classical diagonal, or it can sometimes go to h3, what I like to call the accelerated fianchetto. In this case, white is able to exchange off bishops on d5, and after bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, the backward pawn is completely blockaded, and after the further moves rook d1 and knight e4, white has a strategically won game. As I've mentioned before, most important of the three types of pawn structures, balanced, weak, and dynamic, are weak pawn structures, because weak pawn structures are your basics. They are your foundations. By using and understanding these pawn structures, you can win in your tournament games. Now then, let me set you up for the second part of study segment 2, balanced pawn structures. Balanced pawn structures are precisely that. They're balanced, quiet games. There are three types of balanced pawn structures. Quiet positions, like 3 and 3 versus 3 and 3, locked positions, and solid pawn structures. In 3 and 3 versus 3 and 3 positions, the games are very quiet. The pawns rarely do any of the work. The rooks are generally exchanged on the open files, knights are exchanged in the center squares, and bishops on the diagonals. So the pawns rarely do the work. When there are structural weaknesses, for example, a double pawn, then that becomes the major strategical theme of the position. Another very common balanced pawn structure is a 4 and 2 versus the 4 and 2. Let's go to the studio and learn about that more. In this situation, 4 and 4, 2 and 2, the open files are the C and D files. This is where you'll place your rooks. In the case of bishops, it's more difficult. The bishops for white, the black square bishop might be on the G3 diagonal or the G5 diagonal. For black, the long diagonal. The knights will probably be placed on C6 for black, C3 for white, so that you can control the open files. Let's take a look at this in a game example. In this situation, White prepares to occupy the square c6. This is going to be a tremendous outpost for the white knight. Knights, for some strange reason, do very well when you're white on c6 and f6, or when you're black on c3 and f3. White begins queen b3. This move prepares the way for the rooks to the center files. Also, white's plan will be to control the square c6. After queen b3, rook c8, rook c1, queen b7, check to white's king. White plays the move queen f3, interposing on the check. Trading pieces is gainful when the defender is losing control of the squares that you're trying to attack. After queen f3, white welcomes an exchange of queens in order to strengthen his control of square c6. Black plays knight d5. Even though the position is somewhat quiet, many dangerous things can occur in quiet positions. After this move, black begins to threaten a double check and a checkmate. Black's threat in this position is to play the move knight e5, attacking white's queen, queen e4, f5, forcing white's queen off the long diagonal. And after queen captures e5, white is exposed to a double check, followed by checkmate. Knight f4 check, on king f1, queen h1 mate, and on king g1, queen g2 mate. So, with this threat in mind, white prepares to answer the threat. After knight d5, white plays e4, driving away the knight from its centralized square. The knight retreats to f6, and now white plays b5. This move is entirely in accordance with white's plan, which is to control the square c6. Black now has a problem: how to combat this square. He decides that he's going to weaken the support of the c6 square by playing a6. After a6, white plays knight c6. Now, the result of white's plan is strikingly obvious. The knight controls an enormous number of squares, 2, 4, 6, of black's territory. In addition, he opens up the long diagonal for his bishop. After knight c6, black is threatened with a fork on e7 and forced to retreat, bishop f8. a4, maintaining control of b5, which supports a knight on c6. A takes b5, a takes b5. This explains why neither player moved their rook off the a file, because both players had anticipated this position, and both players wanted to keep a rook on the open file. After rook takes a1, rook takes a1, black played the move rook a8. I'll skip ahead for a moment, and I'll tell you why white plays the move he now plays. He has a space advantage, and he refuses to trade pieces. Rook d1, bringing the rook to an open file. Even though there are knights on the files, it's still open, because it's the pawns that determine whether the files are open or closed. After rook d1, black is more or less in an extremely difficult situation. He can't move the knight on d7 because the bishop will capture the knight on f6. Ineffective would be rook a2, because after the move rook a2, white could simply play the move knight c4, defending the bishop on b2, and preparing to come in on the 8th rank with rook d8. So, black kept his rook on a8, and he played the move knight e8. This prepares to develop the knight to c5. After knight e8, knight c4, knight c5. White created another outpost for his knight. He played the move e5. This prepares to come into d6, and now black's really in a great deal of trouble. His best move is probably to sit passively by playing the move h6. Instead, he chose to make a mistake with the move rook c8. This move takes the rook off the open file. There's no reason that black should give up the open file. White played rook a1. This prepares to penetrate to a7, which would trap black's queen. Unable to play rook a8, black played rook c7, and after rook a7, realized his queen is still trapped. On queen c8, knight captures b6, black loses his queen and loses the game. In this type of pawn structure where it's locked, play is going to be dictated by what we call pawn storms. In such a situation, white is going to open the game on the king side with g3 and f4, attacking e5, or a3, b4, attacking c5. Pawn storms on the king side, pawn storms on the queen side. Black is going to do likewise with a6 and b5 on the queen side, g6 and f5 on the king side. Most fundamental key about locked structures is what we call the base pawn. The base pawn for black in this situation is d6. The base pawn is sort of like the keystone. It supports the entire pawn chain. If white was to play the move f3, then the base pawn would become g2. If white was to play the move b3, then the base pawn becomes a2. The base pawn as such constitutes where we should focus our attack. In this skeleton here, we have what we call the closed French. In the closed French, for black, the base pawn is f7. For white, the base pawn is b2. White's play will be geared towards attacking the base with f4, g4, f5. It's very typical that white should play fe6, f captures e6, and suddenly the new base becomes e6. From black's point of view, he'll be playing b5, a5, b4, and attacking the base, the new base, c3. Again, in locked structures, the most fundamental thing to understand is to attack the base. The base forms the focus of the entire strategy, the plan. This is a typical situation arising from a king's Indian defense. From black's point of view, his chain is from c7 to f4. It becomes your job when you're playing white to attack this base. From white's point of view, our base is the pawn g2. g2 supports the entire chain. We lose g2, we lose the game. Vice versa. Black loses c7, he loses the game. White begins the attack with the move b6. After b6, a captures b6, a captures b6. Black must now abandon this pawn chain. He cannot play the move cb because then after cd, all the pawns fall. So instead, he captures on c5. White captures on c7. Black captures on c7. White now plays the interference move d6. Black's queen on c7 was protecting the pawn on e5. d6 cuts that protection. After d6, queen c6. The new base is now e5. White changes, or his plan, I should say, evolves. With the new base being e5, he changes his attack, and he attacks the new base. After bishop b2, he opens up the a file. Black exchanges rooks on the a file and plays b5 in order to capture d6. After b5, knight captures e5, queen captures d6, bishop captures b5. White has succeeded in his entire aims, which was to destroy this pawn chain. This pawn chain that was before so nice and comfortable, giving black a good game, is now completely gone. As a result, black's entire game is in shambles, and the attack that he had anticipated on the king side is about to rebound against him. A very fundamental principle. An attack on the flank is best met with a counterattack in the center. Another key to understanding locked pawn structures is when the pawns on the flanks, whether they be king side or queen side, are locked, it's important to understand that that flank becomes an ideal haven for a king. For example, in this skeleton, the pawns on this king side are locked. White's king would say belong on h2, and in that way he could turn his attention to the queen side in the center, knowing that his king is safe. In a game I had in 1979 in Holland, I was playing the black pieces. In this situation, White has been attacking me very strongly on the king side. He's managed to open up the H file. From the pawn structure, I determined what were the key lines and files and diagonals of attack. The only open file in the position is the H file. So whoever controls that file is going to have an advantage. In addition, the best diagonal in this situation is this long diagonal. The queen side's completely locked. So I determined that that's where my king belonged. I played the move king d7. This is a very, very strange, uncommon move. Normally, the king is castled. In this situation, I moved the king one square at a time to a flank. When you move the king one square at a time to a flank, queen side or king side, it's called castling by hand. It's not to be recommended. But the reason I played it is because I recognized that the king on the queen side would be quite safe. And in a sense, that's what being a pro is all about, knowing when to make the wrong moves, but at the right time. After king d7, I'm preparing to take over the H file. My opponent played knight d2, and I challenged him on the H file. He now recognized that it would be a mistake to capture on h8, because then after queen captures h8, I would have a battery on the long diagonal, and I would control the open H file. So my opponent played rook g1. After rook g1, king c7, my opponent recognized that the long diagonal, being the diagonal to control, tried to trade pieces. He played rook b1, with the idea to play b3 and bishop b2, and to challenge me on the open diagonal. Anticipating this plan, I played rook h3. And after b3, I played queen h8, which forms a rather unusual double battery. I control the open H file as well as the long diagonal. After queen h8, my opponent realized that he could no longer challenge the open diagonal, played knight f1. After knight f1, knight d7, bringing the reserves into play, bishop f4, in order to challenge the sweet center square e5, played knight e5. We exchange knights on e5, followed by an exchange of bishops on e5. After queen captures e5, after f3, defending e4, I now played the move bishop d7. Now let's take a full stop and just look at the position for a moment. Black has complete domination of all the key points. In space, he's well ahead. His rook on h3 is on the only open file in the position. In addition, he can bring in the other rook on the h file. And in short, black quickly won. The question is, what was the key to this? How did this all evolve from just a few moves? Well, the key was the maneuver king d7 to c7, castling by hand. Black recognized the pawn structure was telling him the plan, and he followed through. Chess is an unusual sport in that you will always find an opponent who you have a particular trouble with. whether he always beats you in open type positions or half open position or closed positions. For such a type of opponent, it's good to have a solid system. And I recommend two. The first is the Dutch stonewall. It's noted as such for its extremely solid pawns in the center, d4, e3, f4. In the Dutch stonewall, usually white is castled kingside. The knights come to this wonderful outpost on e5, knight e5, and it's often followed up by knight f3 for their supporting e5. White squared bishop usually goes on a d3 diagonal, and white can bring his queen to the king side to h5, or use a rook lift, rook f3, rook h3. The drawback of the stonewall is the black squared bishop. Normally what you try to do is to develop it before you set up the stonewall to g5, or sometimes you make an accelerated fianchetto going out to a3. In a typical game-type position, we have what we call the Pillsbury attack. I appreciate that the Pillsbury attack doesn't exactly follow the skeleton, and indeed, some of my game examples don't follow the skeletons exactly, but they're very similar. In the Pillsbury attack, the pawn isn't on c3, the knight's on c3. What we have here is a wonderful outpost for the knight on e5, guarded by pawns on d4 and f4. Even though this is a solid defensive pawn structure for white, he can also use it for the attack, as I'll show. White plays the move queen h3 with a double attack against the square h7. White now threatens to capture on d7, followed by a capture on f6, and then the checkmate on h7. Black is forced to create a weakness, g6. If he plays the move h6, then we can sacrifice on h6 and perform a rook lift. After g6, white plays the move f5. White has a tremendous buildup of forces on the king side. Black's play is on the queen side. Therefore, he plays the move b4, trying to stop white on the king side by counterattacking on the queen side. White, however, pursues his attack. Plays f, captures g6, sacrificing his knight. If black makes the mistake of capturing this Greek gift, then after b captures c3, white performs checkmate. Plays bishop captures f6, threatening queen captures h7 checkmate. If h captures g6, queen h8 checkmate. If f captures g6, then queen e6 check and mate in 1. So after bishop captures f6, black is forced to play knight captures f6. Now comes rook captures f6. Again, threatening mate in 1 with queen captures h7 check. So black is forced to respawn. F captures g6. After f captures g6, bishop captures g6. Again, white is threatening checkmate in 1. H g6 allows rook g6 checkmate, so black is forced to play rook takes f6. Now white has a mate in 2. You figure that one out. So black doesn't accept the offer of the sacrifice piece. Instead, he recaptures h captures g6. After hg6, white decided to set up a battery on the h4 d8 diagonal with queen h4. To queen h4, black had nothing else to do, no other recourse, but to play b captures c3. After b captures c3, knight captures d7. Black can't recapture with the knight because of the pin on the diagonal. It would cost him an exchange. So instead he played queen takes d7. In study segment 4, I'll give you more rules on how to continue these type of attacks. But it's one thing that's very important to recognize is don't trade attacking pieces for defensive ones. So white played rook takes f6 as opposed to exchanging bishops on f6. After rook takes f6, black couldn't accept the rook because he's going to get mated on h8. So instead, he prepares to defend the square g6 by playing the move a5. White is threatening in the position to play bishop takes g6, or to prepare to play bishop takes g6. After a5, always remember to bring your reserves into the attack if you can. After rook f1, creating a battery on the f file, rook a6 to defend across the 6th rank. White now played bishop captures g6, threatening checkmate in 1. After bishop takes g6, f takes g6, white played rook takes f8 check, bishop takes f8. Now he played rook takes f8 check. This move illustrates the wonderful attacking ability of the queen. The queen is a tremendously formidable attacker and a very poor defender. Here, white sacrifices a rook in order to bring his queen into the attack with queen h8. After king takes f8, black can get mated in several ways. After queen h8 check, king f7, queen h7 check, king e6 allows the Gordian mate, queen takes g6, king e8 allows queen g8 checkmate. So instead, black is forced to play king f8, allowing his queen to be skewed. Our third part of study segment 2 is the dynamic pawn structures. In dynamic pawn structures, the pawns play a much greater role. Let's go to the studio and see what I mean. Our third type of pawn structures are dynamic pawn structures. What distinguishes them from the other two is that pawns play a greater role, indeed an almost decisive role. In dynamic pawn structures, the value of the pieces fluctuate. In some cases, a queen really isn't worth 9, she's worth less, or a rook isn't worth 5, he's worth less. Our first type of dynamic pawn structure is the passed pawn. A pawn is really at its best when it is passed. In this skeleton, white's pawn on c5 is passed. When it advances, no black pawn will be able to blockade it or capture it. As a result, the white pawn can go through to promotion. Most promotions take place in the endgame, when there are fewer pieces to hinder the pawn's advance. We'll be featuring two main examples of a passed pawn. Our first one, white has a passed pawn on e5, which is currently pinned. As Capablanca said, when the number of pieces on the board diminishes, the passed pawn increases in strength. We also have another quote, and that quote is, "Passed pawns must be pushed." And that's precisely what white does. He plays e6. Now, black has a choice. We'll see right over here, if black captures the bishop, then white plays e7, attacking the rook. After rook e8, all white needs to do is get rid of that rook, and that pawn's going to promote. And after rook c8, the rook's placed in an absolute pin, backed by the bishop on h3, the pawn's going to promote. So, black cannot play bishop captures d4. Back to our main line. Black played rook e8. White now played e7 with a threat to play rook c8 with an absolute pin, followed by the promotion of his pawn. Black closed the file with knight c5. After knight c5, white remembered a fundamental law of mobility for the rooks. Rooks belong on open files. So white played rook f2. White now threatens rook f8 check, rook takes f8, e takes f8 equals queen checkmate. Black cannot play rook captures e7 either, because then rook f8 checkmate, because the bishop's in an absolute pin. Black played king g8, preventing rook f8 check. White now captured the knight, and after bishop captures c5, bc5, the bishop played bishop e6 check in order to drive the king back to h8, and after king h8, white penetrated on the open file, plays rook f7. That's a major principle of having your rook on an open file, is that in order to penetrate the enemy camp. White plays rook f7. Black gave up at this point because there was no way for him to stop the loss of the rook. White's next move is to play bishop d7, followed by promoting the pawn, and white will win the rook. We all know that once a pawn is advanced to the end of the board, it can promote. But I'd like to share with you a cute little tactic, our 11th tactic, called under-promotion. In this situation, we have what is known as the Savadra study. White plays c7, threatening c8 queen. Black plays rook d6 check. Now, white can't step up the board because then he would be placed in an absolute pin, and black could give up his rook for the pawn. Therefore, in this situation, white has to step back. After king b5, rook d5 check, king b4, rook d4 check, king b3, rook d3 check, king c2, black now sets up a cute little trick. He plays rook d4. And now, in this situation, if white was to promote his pawn to a queen, then after c7, c8 equals queen, black plays rook c4 check. Queen captures c4. Whenever we have a situation like this, this is known as stalemate. Black cannot move his king because he would have to move it into capture. Therefore, the game is a draw. So what white does in this position is he under-promotes. Instead of promoting to a queen, he promotes to a rook. The purpose of this is to threaten rook a8, followed by quick checkmate. After c7, c8 equals rook, under promotion, black defends the threatened checkmate, and now comes king b3 with a double attack. Threatens rook c1 checkmate, and king captures a4. So, you see, under promotion is a very tricky tactic. Let's go back to the studio and study how to defend against passed pawns. Our next main line is what to do when playing against the passed pawn. Well, Aaron Nimzovich, summed it up very well. He said the passed pawn is a criminal. Surveillance measures won't do. He must be placed under lock and key. And what he meant by that was blockade. You must learn to blockade your opponent's passed pawns and then capture them. In this situation, Bobby Fischer, playing white against a former world champion, Tigran Petrosian, was faced what to do against the passed pawn. He has a tremendous outpost for his knight on c5, but Bobby understood that bishops are better than knights in open positions, and this is an open position. So therefore, he exchanged his knight for his opponent's bishop in order to get the better minor piece. Knight captures d7 check. To knight d7, rook takes d7. Bobby brought his rook to the open file. White now threatens rook c6 with a double attack against the pawn on a6. Rook d6 preventing that threat. He now played rook c7, threat to double on the 7th, rook e7. After rook c7, Petrosian prevented that by attacking white's rook and interfering with this rook's protection of e7. To knight d7, white dropped back, rook e2, and Petrosian played g6, trying to interfere with the effectiveness of the bishop on d3. As the game evolves from a middle game to an end game, the king can be activated because, again, the king is a powerful piece. He's worth more than a minor piece. So Bobby activates his king, king f2. Black, who's in a very passive position, if he moves his rook on the a file to e8 to challenge white's control of the e file, then after rook e8, an exchange of rooks, followed by rook a7, white is going to win this a6 pawn. So Petrosian played h5. when you have a bishop, fundamental is not to put your pawns on the same color as the bishop. Here, Bobby has two pawns, the f3 and g2 on white squares, and he has a white square bishop. He therefore puts them on dark squares. He plays the move f4. After f4, Petrosian really had no counterplay in the position, played h4. White now plays king f3, activating his king. He's now threatening king g4 and capturing the errant pawn on h4. Petrosian was forced to play f5. This is exactly what Bobby wanted. Bobby wants his opponent to put his pawns on light squares so that he can use his bishop to attack them. Bobby now played king e3 with the idea of restraining the passed pawn on d5. He plans to blockade it with king d4 and then to capture it. Petrosian couldn't allow that to happen and played d4 check. To d4, king d2, white has a threat. And the threat, as we see, is a nice little surrounding and capturing maneuver of the passed pawn. White threatens to play bishop c4, followed by king d3, and in order to exchange the defender, play rook e6. After the rooks are exchanged, this pawn will be blockaded and lost. Faced with this threat, Petrosian had to find a response. The response wasn't so good either. He had to play knight b6 in order to prevent bishop c4. But this allowed white to penetrate and to double rooks on the 7th. Up in the barbaric Northwest, where I come from, when we double rooks on the 7th, we say the rooks are on the refreshment stall. After rook e7, knight d5, we have what we call a quadruple fork here. Both rooks are attacked, both pawns are attacked. But white had foreseen that the black king is too vulnerable on the back rank. After rook f7 check, king e8, white moved his other rook out of capture. Black now played knight takes f4. White played bishop c4, knight d5. Coming back, and after bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, Bobby played rook h7 with unstoppable rook h8, checkmate with the major pieces. This exemplifies Nimzovich's theories of restraint, blockade, destroy. Now we'll go on to some more examples. Protected passed pawns are simply passed pawns in a more powerful version. In this skeleton, the pawn on c5 is the protected passed pawn. The reason they're more powerful is simply that they're more difficult to capture. Be very hesitant when pushing a protected passed pawn. The reason is, if it doesn't promote, you're undercutting its support. Now, let's return to my blitz game with Alexander Chernin, which we saw during our discussion of pawn islands. In this position, both players have passed pawn. White has a passed a pawn, and black has a passed f pawn. My f pawn is more dangerous because it has advanced farther than Chernin's a pawn. With the move f2 check, I use a removal of the guard tactic to win a bishop. Once I'm a piece ahead, I'll try to exchange rooks. The game is now won, but the question remains, can I make all the moves necessary to checkmate white before my flag falls? Note that at every stage of this game, play is determined by a passed pawn. Chernin has to allow me another passed pawn because his king is in stalemate. It has no legal moves. At the start of this scene, I had what are known as connected passed pawns. Let's return to the studio to learn about them. An even more powerful example of passed pawns are the connected passed pawns. In this situation, white has connected passed pawns on b4 and a4. They're extraordinarily powerful because they work with each other in pushing the blockader away. When you have just one passed pawn, it can be blockaded, such as in our Fischer example. But with two, they work with each other. The connected pass pawns can be extremely powerful. As I mentioned earlier about dynamic pawn structures, they can change the value of pieces. Connected pass pawns that are pushed 2 squares away from promotion are worth a rook. Connected pass pawns, when they're both 1 square away from promotion, can be worth more than a queen. For example, in our game example, we have Timon v. Nance. In this situation, White has a superior position. He could, for example, play E captures F5, B captures C3, B captures C3, and he would be a pawn up and have a better position. Instead, White embarks on a faulty combination. He plays the move E5. After E5, White had anticipated the black queen moving. After the black queen moves to, say, a square like B6, then after A captures B4, Black couldn't then respond queen captures B4 because E captures F6 would win a piece. White would therefore be a pawn up with an excellent position. A 1 position, in fact. Instead, however, White was in for a big surprise. After E5, Black sacrificed his queen for a knight. He played B captures C3. White being obligated E D6, E captures D6. And now Black has the much vaunted connected pass pawns. After the further move moves rook E1, C3, it was quite obvious that White, although he's up a queen for a knight, is dead lost. White played the move queen B4 in order to prevent the pass pawns from pushing any further, but then came knight D5, attacking the queen, queen B7, C2, sacrificing the knight. White realized that queen captures D5 would allow C1 equals queen, followed by B1 equals queen. So instead, White decided to get counterplay, he had to push his own pass pawn, and played D7. Black sidestepped with his rook, played rook C8, D8. White now played bishop D3. This is the case of too little, too late. Black played C1 equals queen. And after C1 equals queen, queen captures D5, rook captures D7, attacking the queen, queen A8 check, bishop F8. White has a big problem. He's not going to stop that other pawn from queening, and after bishop takes F5, rook D1 wins easily. White's king is in an absolute pin. After a further move like G takes F5, B1 equals queen is unstoppable. The question then becomes, if pass pawns, protected pass pawns, and connected pass pawns are so powerful, how do we get them? Well, we get them by playing with majorities. In this skeleton, each side has their own majority. Black has a 4-3 majority on the king side, White a 3-2 majority on the queen side. Pass pawns come about when players decide it's time to push their majorities. In Black's case, he'll push his majority to E3, create a pass pawn. White's case, he'll play C4, B4, C5, B5, and C6. Another important note to make about pawn majorities is the long pawn chain versus short pawn chain pawn majority. In my experience, it's better to have a long pawn chain than a balanced pawn chain. For example, I would much rather have a 5-1 pawn chain than a 3-3, or a 4-2. I would much rather have a pawn chain of a 4-2 versus a 3-3. I don't like balanced pawn chains so much as I like a long pawn chain. We'll now look at a game example featuring majorities. Here, the pawn structures predict a very dynamic struggle. White has a pawn majority on the king side, black on the queen side. In addition, white is threatening the knight fork, knight f6, attacking the rook on e8, and the pawn on h7. The pawn on h7 being isolated is quite a target. Another thing to also remember about dynamic pawn structures is it requires foresight, calculation, and visualization, because in dynamic pawn structures you're going to get very, very sharp positions. So you ought to be able to practice visualization, and you can do this by going over tactical books, and we'll be recommending some books for you to get. In this situation, black decided to sacrifice a bishop in order to get a host of passed pawns. He played c captures b3, white captured rook captures c8, rook c8. It would have been better to play bishop c8. White now played bishop takes a6, accepting black's offer. Rook c2 check, king f3, b3 captures a2. Black is now anticipating playing rook c1 in order to promote his passed pawn. White is forced to blockade with rook a1. In his combination of 4 series of moves, black had anticipated that he would have a winning game. He thought that after his move bishop b4, there was no way to stop bishop c3, followed by the promotion of his pawn, and he would win back his sacrifice material and have connected passed pawns on the queen side. However, white also has his play on the king side. He has his majority, and white had anticipated the same combination and played the move bishop d3. Black cannot now play bishop c3 because white captures the rook, plays bishop b3, and captures the passed pawn. This is a nice law of mobility, or a nice characteristic of the bishops. The bishops are the best piece to handle connected passed pawns. After bishop d3, rook d2, white captured the isolated pawn on h7. And after bishop h7, bishop c3, white captured the passed pawn on a2, and rook takes a2. Black must have been very happy at this point because he felt he had won back his sacrifice material, but then came the rude reality that after g4, g5, there's no way to stop white's passed pawn. And indeed, after the move d4, g6 check, king e7, g7, there was no way to prevent g8 equals queen, promoting the pawn to a queen, and white wins easily. Now that we've learned about connected passed pawns and majorities, let's look at an earlier stage of my game with Chernin. You saw how I pushed my passed pawns on the king side and won the game. But how did I get these passed pawns? Since I have a 4-2 majority on the king side, I push my pawns there. Activating my bishop with a double attack against white's rook and g2 pawn. I now bring both rooks to open files and increase my control of space. Excellent! By trading a pair of kingside pawns, I convert my 4-2 majority into a 3-1. This brings us near the concluding phase of the game, which you watched earlier in this study segment. Pushing our majorities is the ideal. Sometimes, though, you must play with a minority. Here's what I mean. A minority attack comes about when the majorities are inflexible. It's not always that we can use the majorities, because if we try to push them, they may be captured. In such a case, we would use a minority attack. Minority attack was relatively unknown until the turn of the century. Here we have a skeleton of a minority attack. From White's point of view, his majority is on the king's side. But the moment he tries to advance them, he can weaken his structure. As a result, he advances where he stands with his minority. He plays the move b4, the idea a4, and b5. The purpose of the minority attack is to force a backward pawn on an open file, in this case the c file. From Black's point of view, he'll play his minority attack with f5, f4, and try to force a backward pawn on the e file. Let's take a look at our game example. In this example, the rook on b1 supports White's minority attack, and he plays the move b4 with the idea of playing b5. Another important purpose of the minority attack is not only to give the opponent a backward pawn on the open file, but also to use the most advanced outpost. One of the things about the minority attack is it violates the classical theory. The classical theory always says, attack where you have an advantage in force. The minority attack doesn't do that. It attacks where we have a disadvantage in force. However, there are some classical reasons why it's okay, acceptable, and that is you open up the position on the queen side where you have an half-open c file. After b4, ab, ab, Black decided to start a minority attack of his own. He played the move g5. This was a mistake. It would have been better for him to have done passive play with the move bishop d7, as White's minority attack is going to get there first. After g5, b5. Now Black has a problem. It would have been a mistake for White to play bishop takes f5, as we'll see over here. If White had played bishop takes f5, this would have undercut the support for the knight on a4, and it would have led to a tactic, the removal of the guard. Black would have captured on f5, and after the queen recaptures on f5, the knight on a4 would no longer be protected, and after rook takes a4, White would have lost a piece. So White refused the opportunity to capture the pawn, and instead came back and continued with his plan, which was the minority attack. After b5, Black was forced to compromise his pawn structure. Remember what I was teaching you about pawn islands. Now Black has 3 pawn islands, and these 2 pawns, the b7 and d5 pawns, are going to become isolated. White responded with bishop takes b5. The reason that Black had to compromise his pawn structure was because if he had chosen to defend it with bishop d7, then he would have been exposed to a fork. After b captures c6, bc, White plays knight b6, attacking bishop on d7, rook on a8. Rook is forced to move, say to b8. Then after knight takes d7, queen takes d7. The pawn on f5 can now be captured. White would win the pawn and the game. So again, this means that Black couldn't play bishop d7, and he should have played bishop d7 before he had played the move g5. As the situation stands, after bishop takes b5, the rook on e8 was forced to move again. For bishop d7, then after an exchange on d7 again, the knight b6 fork exists. After bishop b5, Black played rook e7. White now played bishop d3, threatening to play knight b6, which would fork the rook on b8 and the pawn, and preparing to capture bishop f5. Black prevented this with bishop c7. And now with these pawn islands, all White has to do is attack the pawns because now they're much weaker. White plays knight c3 with a threat to play knight takes d5 and an absolute pin on the queen and the king. Also, white threatens bishop f5. Black defends both threats with rook f7, and now rook b5. Black is given a choice of which pawn to lose, the b7 pawn or the d5 pawn. Just a quick word about pawns. Although we say pawns are worth 1, and all pawns are relatively equal unless they're doubled, I have a theory. My theory says that the center pawns, D and E pawns, and the C and F pawns, are stronger than any other pawns. So given a choice of which pawn to lose, you would rather lose a flank pawn as compared to a center pawn. Anyway, that's an advanced concept. We'll get into those things later. After rook b5, black defended with bishop e6. And white captured. Rook takes b7. After rook c8, black prepares a pin on the c file. White gets out of this pin with queen b3, also defending the rook on b7. After bishop a5, with an attack on the knight on c3, knight came back to e2, and after rook takes, b7, queen b7, rook b8, queen c6, attacking the bishop, rook b6, white dropped back. After queen c2, attacking f5, black plays g6, white plays g4, attacking f5 again, and after queen c8, white traded queens, and after bishop c8, you can find the move that caused black to resign. The diamond pawn structure is a result of two captures. It's usually played when employing the minority attack. It's distinguished, the skeleton is distinguished by double f pawn. It's an extremely solid structure, allowing the king on g1 to be well protected and insulated. Normally, this allows you to attack on the queen side. The diamond pawn structure usually results from Queen's Gambit exchanges, Slavs. Also, there's some Sicilians and Caro-Cans where it comes from. The diamond pawn structure, being a derivative of the minority attack, the reason I didn't put in a game example is because we simply ran out of time. We have a lot of good news to tell you. On tape 2, there are more examples of weak, balanced, and dynamic pawn structures. So far, we've concentrated upon the fourth element, pawn structure, to teach you how to plan your attacks. On tape 2, study segment 4, we'll be looking at the other elements, force, space, and time, to plan and concoct attacks. Now, let's take a look at Jesse and Tina playing more blitz games. Both Jesse and Tina know their basic principles, but Tina knows them only by rote. Jesse tries to take advantage of her inexperience by setting up an early queen takes f7 checkmate. Tina feels flustered under the pressure of the clock. Knowing that Jesse has only a minute, she plays quickly, trying to force him to lose on time. Jesse springs his trap. Overlooking her brother's devilish plan, Tina falls into disaster.
Checkmate. Checkmate. Thank you.
I always get a big kick out of watching beginners fall for scholar's mate, fool's mate. Let me show you a few of the elementary mates from the openings. The earliest that a player can lose is in 2 moves. Queen h4, checkmate. This is what is known as fool's mate. The most common type of checkmate that I've seen over and over and over again in many, many beginners' games is what is commonly called scholar's mate. To e4, e5, queen h5, which we know from the basic principles is a bad move, attacking the e5 pawn, knight c6, defending the pawn, bishop c4. White threatens an immediate mate with queen f7. Black blithely ignores the threat, knight f6, which allows queen takes f7, check, mate. Our third type of mate, again, features the f7 weakness, and is called Legal's mate. After e4, e5, knight f3, attacking the pawn, d6, black plays a Philidors, bishop c4, developing. Bishop g4, not quite the best move. Knight c3, continuing developing. And now, if black makes a doodah move, this allows a very nice combination called Legal's mate. After knight captures e5, white moves his knight out of a relative pin, and after bishop takes d1, we have bishop takes f7, check, king e7, knight d5, checkmate. I hope you'll be able to use some of these elementary mates in your games, but keep in mind it's usually beginners that fall for them. This completes study segment 2. We'll now be going to study segment 3, which will be teaching you split pawns, screen backward pawns, which was similar to the backward pawn I showed you in tape 1. Now let's go to the studio for split pawns. Now for split pawns. Split pawns refer specifically to flank pawns, the A and C or the F and H. In the skeleton that we have before us, the split pawns for white are A2 and C4. Split pawns are basically flank pawns that have been isolated. Both pawns, the A2 and C4 pawns, are both isolated. Split pawns become weaker as the game progresses because they need piece protection, just like isolated pawns. It's not necessary to center your attention on split pawns in the middle game, but just to place your pieces effectively, because as I say, they'll get weaker and weaker as the game progresses. In this situation, black has split pawns on A7 and C5. White plays rook E1, bringing his rook to the open file and preparing the battery rook F E3. Black now played knight F6 with the discovery against the rook on F3. Knight G5 has an interesting sub-variation which we'll look at right over here. If knight G5 with the double attack against the rook on F3, white has an opportunity for a very rare tactic. This tactic is going to be called the windmill, or in some countries, the seesaw. After rook G3, black avoids a move like bishop G7 followed by H4 by moving the knight on G5, defending C5. After knight E6, you sacrifice an exchange. When you sacrifice an exchange, you sacrifice a rook, a major piece, for a minor piece, a bishop or knight. After your exchange sacrifice rook E6, and after Fe, you force the move rook G7 check, forces the move king H8. You force your opponent to walk into a discovered check. And after king H8, then comes rook captures E7, discovered check by the bishop. If now king G8, then comes rook G7 check. The king is forced once again to move into a discovery, and then white can wipe out the whole black army. The windmill or seesaw tactic is really one of the most devastating tactics in chess. Seesaw can wipe out the entire enemy army. Back to the main line. After knight F6, attacking the rook, white plays rook E3. He now has a double attack. He attacks the bishop on E7 as well as the pawn on C5. After rook E3, black plays knight D5. Knight D5, attacking white's rook and forcing white to respond before he captures the pawn on C5. White moves, rook G3. This again threatens the windmill tactic. Black responds to the windmill tactic by the move G6. After G6, white captures knight takes C5. White wins a pawn. If black plays queen A5, as in this sub-variation, two pieces of white, the knight on C5 and the rook on E1 are being attacked. White plays rook captures E7. Knight captures e7. Knight captures b7. White wins two pieces, two minor pieces for a rook, wins force, and he has a devastating position. So queen a5 can't be played. Back to our main line, after knight takes c5, instead of the move queen a5, black plays the move rook c8. White now avoids playing knight takes b7 because he realizes that after rook takes c2, he'll also lose this bishop. So, first, white plays the move b4, defending the knight. After b4, white's a pawn up, and black has to immediately reestablish equality in the force count, otherwise he'll be lost. So, if he plays knight takes b4, as in our sub-variation over here, if he plays knight takes b4, then we have queen c3, a devastating move because it threatens checkmate in 1 on the long diagonal. After queen c3, black would be forced to respond to this mate threat by a move like f6. This would allow queen captures b4, followed by the win of the bishop on b7. So, back to our main variation, the knight cannot capture the pawn on b4.